May 11, 1982, 14:30 hours. Air Force Historical Research Agency, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. Amid the musty scent of aging paper and drying ink, Colonel Cass Hough, a man in his late 70s with eyes that still held the sharp focus of a pilot, leaned toward the spinning reels of a Sony TC-580 tape recorder. He was finally explaining the unwritten rule that won the air war over Europe. With a quiet, almost reverent tone, he detailed the forbidden technique, the delicate dance of pushing the P-51's mixture lever past the auto-lean detent, setting the RPM to exactly 2,400 and manifold pressure to 35 inches, a secret he and General Jimmy Doolittle had kept for nearly 40 years. It was a confession wrapped in a technical briefing, the final declassification of a pilot's whisper. The genesis of this secret was born from absolute desperation. The latter half of 1943 had been a bloodbath for the 8th Air Force. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17 had cost 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses, and the 2nd Schweinfurt raid on October 14, a day forever seared into the collective memory as Black Thursday, saw another 60 bombers fall from the sky. Over 200 skilled airmen were lost in just those two missions. The blunt, horrifying reality was that the American escort fighters, primarily the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, with its powerful but thirsty Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, simply couldn't go the distance. They were forced to turn back at the German border, leaving the bomber streams naked and vulnerable to the seasoned pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader. The new commander, Lieutenant General James Jimmy Doolittle, an MIT-educated aeronautical engineer and a man who understood calculated risk better than anyone, arrived at his headquarters at RAF High Wycombe in January 1944 with an impossible mandate from General Karl Spaatz: destroy the Luftwaffe, or the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord, was off. The air at his command post, codenamed Pine Tree, was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the palpable weight of failure. This was the problem dropped squarely on the desk of Colonel Cass Hough. A 1926 University of Michigan engineering graduate, Hough was the technical executive for the 8th Fighter Command, a hands-on, grease-under-the-fingernails problem solver who trusted empirical data over factory warnings. He wasn't a desk jockey. He was a former test pilot for the Daisy Manufacturing Company, a man who habitually wore his worn A-2 flight jacket indoors, and whose defining characteristic was a relentless curiosity. While the strategic planners under General Doolittle were mapping out the 100-mile round trips to Berlin, Hough was in a cold Nissan hut, surrounded by engine diagrams and fuel consumption charts, listening to the incessant drumming of English rain on the corrugated steel roof. He wasn't looking for a new piece of hardware. He was looking for a trick, a loophole in the laws of physics and mechanics that everyone else had missed, a way to wring out just 90 more minutes of flight time. At the heart of the dilemma was a magnificent piece of machinery, and the man sent to protect it. The North American P-51 Mustang was a game-changer, but its soul was the Packard V1650-7, a license-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This one, 695 cubic inch, 27-liter V12 beast, could produce 490 horsepower at 19,800 feet. But it was governed by strict operational limits, enforced by men like Harold Hayman Haynes, the chief technical representative from the Packard Motor Car Company. Haynes was the voice of the manual, warning that running the engine too lean would cause detonation, foul the 12 spark plugs, and seize the entire engine in seconds. The fate of thousands of airmen and the entire Allied invasion of Europe rested on solving an impossible equation of fuel, distance, and time. The Luftwaffe, under the command of experts like General Adolf Galland, knew the American fighters had a, quote, of no return, well short of Berlin. They were confident they could savage the unescorted bomber fleets over the capital of the Reich, bleeding the 8th Air Force dry. The High Command needed a miracle, and they needed it before the first Berlin raid scheduled for March 1944. They turned to Colonel Hull, the one man who believed the answer wasn't in a new fuel tank, but hidden within the machine itself. Before I tell you how Colonel Cass Hough and his pilots discovered the Merlin's whisper, a secret that would allow them to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how a forbidden, unwritten technique systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe. The brutal reality of the air war was etched into the very soil of East Anglia in the autumn of 1943. After Black Thursday on October 14th, when General Ira Eaker's 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s and 600 men attacking the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants, a funereal quiet settled over bases like RAF Thorpe Abbotts. The commander of the 100th Bomb Group, Colonel Neil Chick Harding, could only watch as the ground crews waited for planes that would never return. The problem was simple arithmetic. The P-47 Thunderbolt, their primary escort, had a combat radius of barely 375 miles, forcing it to turn back long before the bombers reached their deepest targets. This tactical limitation was a godsend for the Luftwaffe. General Adolf Galland, a man who practically lived in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, had perfected the German response. His pilots in Jägerschwader 1 and Jägerschwader 26 would wait, circling like sharks just outside the P-47's range. The moment the American little friends waggled their wings and peeled off for home near Aachen, Germany, the slaughter would begin. The German FW-190s, armed with 4 devastating 20mm MG-151 cannons, would dive on the bomber streams, the air filling with the stench of cordite and burning glycol from punctured B-17 engines. The American weapon of choice, the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, was a marvel of defensive armament, bristling with 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns that created a lethal cone of fire. But it was still a 30-ton aircraft, lumbering through the sky at 180 miles per hour. The combat box formation, a staggered stack of 18 to 21 bombers designed for mutual protection, couldn't stop determined attacks. By December 1943, the combined bomber offensive was hanging by a thread. General Henry Hap Arnold, the chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was facing pressure from Washington to halt the daylight raids entirely, a decision that would have crippled the entire strategy for invading Europe. The campaign involved over 2,000 heavy bombers and 150,000 personnel, and its centerpiece was failing. The turning point came on January 6, 1944, with the arrival of a new commander. Lieutenant General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, the audacious leader of the 1942 Tokyo raid, and a man with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, replaced the more conservative General Eaker. Doolittle brought an aggressive, calculating mindset to the 8th Air Force headquarters at RAF High Wycombe, his directive from General Carl Spaatz, commander of all U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, was chillingly clear. The Luftwaffe had to be destroyed by June 1944, or the D-Day invasion Operation Overlord would be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. The workhorse of the fighter command at that time was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Pilots like Colonel Hubert Zemke, the fiery leader of the 56th Fighter Group, respected the Jug. It was a 7-ton behemoth built around a massive 300-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp 18-cylinder radial engine. With 8.50 caliber machine guns, it could shred anything it hit, but its internal fuel capacity of just 305 gallons was a critical flaw. Even when fitted with a 108-gallon drop tank, its thirst was unquenchable, limiting its effective escort range and making deep strikes into Germany impossible. The constant, overwhelming smell of 100-octane avgas on every airfield was a perpetual reminder of its short legs. The great hope, the aircraft everyone was waiting for, was the North American P-51 Mustang. It began arriving in the European theater in significant numbers in late November 1943. The original Allison V-1710 engine had been a disappointment at altitude, but the brilliant move, championed by U.S. military attaché Major Thomas Hitchcock, Jr., was to fit the sleek, laminar flow airframe with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin 60 series engine. The result was the Packard V1650-7, a 27-liter, 490-horsepower V12 that transformed the Mustang into a high-altitude world beater. The first pilots to fly it, like those in the 354th Fighter Group, knew they had a winner. But even with an internal capacity of 184 gallons and two 75-gallon drop tanks, a mission to Berlin and back, over 100 miles, was still a mathematical impossibility. By the start of 1944, the human cost of this mathematical problem was staggering. The 8th Air Force had already suffered more than 22,000 casualties, with nearly 10,000 men killed in action. The odds were grim. Only 1 in 4 bomber crewmen was expected to complete his 25-mission tour of duty. The psychological toll was immense. In the cold Nissen huts of bases like RAF Netteschall, the sight of an empty bunk, and the quiet, methodical packing of a fallen friend's personal effects by a supply sergeant was a nightly, heartbreaking ritual for survivors like Major John C. Egan of the 100th Bomb Group. The pressure from the top was relentless. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had made it clear to General Spaatz that the success of the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, was entirely contingent on achieving air superiority. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who were reading German Enigma traffic via the Ultra program, painted a grim picture. Under the efficient direction of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, German single-engine fighter production had soared to over 1,800 aircraft per month by February 1944. The Allies weren't just losing, they were being outproduced. From the German perspective, their strategy was working perfectly. The Reichsverteidigung, Defense of the Reich, pilots were battle-hardened veterans, led by aces like Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft of Jagdgeschwader 54. They flew superb aircraft, including the Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, a radial-engine fighter armed with a mix of 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Their tactics, refined by General Major Josef Schmid, focused on a single critical 20-minute window of opportunity, the time after the Allied escorts turned for home. They would then attack the unescorted bombers with everything they had, including massive formations of twin-engine Zerstorer heavy fighters armed with 21 cm WGR, 21 rockets designed to blow a B-17 out of the sky from 1,000 meters away. Behind the front lines, the war was a logistical behemoth. Every piece of equipment, from a single .50 caliber bullet to a complete Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, had to be shipped 3,000 miles across an Atlantic Ocean infested with German U-boats commanded by Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. In January 1944 alone, keeping the 8th Air Force operational required over 600,000 tons of supplies. A single mission by 500 B-17s could consume more than 850,000 gallons of high-octane fuel. It was a war of numbers, and the Allies were struggling to make them add up. On the ground, an army of civilian specialists worked alongside the military mechanics. Men like Harold Heyman Haynes, the chief technical representative from the Packard Motor Car Company, were vital. Stationed at fighter bases like RAF Bodny, home of the 352nd Fighter Group, Haynes was the ultimate authority on the V16507 Merlin engine. His hands, perpetually stained with oil and smelling of metallic solvents, had fine-tuned hundreds of them. He was a stickler for the manual, constantly reminding pilots and crew chiefs that running the engine leaner than the auto-lean detent risked catastrophic detonation, with cylinder head temperatures rocketing past the 250°C limit. The very environment was an adversary. The winter of 1943-1944 was one of the worst on record. Thick, persistent fog, known locally as P-Supers, could ground the entire 8th Air Force for days, covering the airfields in a damp, chilling blanket. At 28,000 feet, cockpit temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, causing severe frostbite on exposed skin and turning the moisture and oxygen masks to ice. The physical exhaustion was etched on every pilot's face, a weariness you could see in the perpetually tired eyes of aces like Major George Preddy Jr., a former barnstormer who seemed to live on coffee and Camel cigarettes. By February 1944, one target had become an obsession for the High Command: Berlin. The Big B was more than just the capital of the Reich. It was a symbol. Hermann Göring had famously boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach it in daylight. Proving him wrong was a strategic and psychological necessity, but the 100-mile round trip remained just beyond their reach. The planners at Pine Tree knew that without a continuous escort, sending the bombers to Berlin would be a suicide mission. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic were scrambling for a hardware solution. They designed larger 165-gallon ferry tanks, but these cumbersome torpedo tanks severely hampered the P-51's agility, making it a sitting duck in a dogfight. Retrofitting the fleet with a new 85-gallon internal fuselage tank was another option, but this created severe center of gravity problems on takeoff and would take at least 4 months to implement, time they simply didn't have. D-Day was just over 100 days away. The solution couldn't be a new piece of metal. It had to be something they already had. This was the suffocating atmosphere of desperation that filled General Doolittle's office at RAF High Wycombe in late February 1944. The smell of stale tobacco hung in the air as he reviewed the casualty projections for the first planned Berlin raid, set for March 4th. The numbers, prepared by his staff statistician, Lieutenant Colonel James Parton, were sickening, predicting losses could exceed 15%, a rate that would cripple the bomber command. It was in this moment, with the entire Allied invasion strategy on the line, that Doolittle sent for Colonel Cass Hough. He didn't want excuses or requisitions. He wanted a solution, right now, using the machines they had. The weight of the world had just landed on Hough's shoulders. Colonel Cass Hough, a man who trusted the feel of a machine more than a printed manual, was certain the answer wasn't in bolting on more aluminum. In his cold Nissen hut at RAF High Wycombe in late November 1943, surrounded by the smell of wet wool and stale coffee, he stared at the schematics for the Packard V16 50-7 Merlin engine. The official operational limits, championed by men like the Packard representative Harold Haynes, were a wall. Hough, a 1926 University of Michigan engineering graduate, intended to find a way through it. He wasn't your typical desk-bound officer. His hands still carried the memory of grease and hydraulic fluid from his test pilot days at the Daisy Manufacturing Company. In early December 1943, Hough secured P-51B Mustang, serial number 4312102, for what he officially termed technical evaluation. He and his most trusted NCO, Master Sergeant John M. Miller, a wiry mechanic who could diagnose an engine by its cough, began a series of clandestine ground tests at RAF Duxford. They ran the Merlin for hours on end, the roar echoing across the damp airfield, meticulously logging data from a specially installed Bendix fuel flow meter. They weren't reading the manual, they were writing their own, listening to the engine's subtle language as they fiddled with settings the factory forbade. The breakthrough came on a frigid morning, December 15, 1943, after 6 straight hours of testing, the air thick with the sweet, cloying smell of 100-octane exhaust. The official Packard manual stated the auto-lean setting provided a fuel-to-air ratio of approximately 0.075, the absolute safest for cruise power. But Hough, a born tinkerer, hypothesized the Bendix-Stromberg PD-18A1 carburetor's automatic controls were deliberately conservative. In a move that would have given Harold Haynes a fit, he had Sergeant Miller disconnect the automatic linkage. He then manually set the RPM to exactly 2,400 and the manifold pressure to 35 inches. Slowly, carefully, he eased the mixture lever back, watching the Bendix meter. The fuel flow plummeted from 68 gallons per hour to a stunning 52, a 23% reduction, before the V-12 even began to protest with a rough shudder. This was pure mechanical heresy. For months, Harold Heyman Haynes had been drilling into pilots that, running the Merlin that lean, would cause catastrophic pre-ignition, sending a piston head clean through the 27-liter engine's block. The 12-cylinder head temperature gauges were their Bible, and the red line at 250 degrees Celsius was the point of no return. Yet, Hugh's thermocouple readings held steady, hovering at a surprisingly cool 220 degrees. He realized the secret wasn't just leaning the mixture. It was the precise, delicate harmony between RPM, manifold pressure, and altitude. Convinced he was onto something that could change the war, Colonel Hough knew ground tests would never be enough. He needed flight data. In late January 1944, he personally flew P-51 B-4312-102 on a series of weather reconnaissance missions over the North Sea, a perfect cover for his unsanctioned experiments. At 25,000 feet, the icy gray water a distant blur below, he engaged the technique. He nudged the mixture lever back, millimeter by millimeter, his ears straining over the radio static to hear the subtle shift in the Merlin's powerful roar. The engine didn't seize. It settled into a new, smoother, quieter hum. After a 4-hour flight, he landed with over 75 gallons of fuel still in his tanks, enough for another 90 minutes of combat flying. The results were undeniable, a game-changer hidden in plain sight. Hough compiled his data, pages filled with fuel flow rates, oil pressures, and cylinder head temperatures logged every 15 minutes, into a slim, top-secret folder labeled Cruise Control Evaluation. In mid-February 1944, he secured a private meeting with General Jimmy Doolittle at Pine Tree headquarters. Doolittle, a man holding a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, grasped the physics immediately as he studied Haugh's hand-drawn graphs. He understood that the Packard V1650-7, with its dual magnetos firing 12 spark plugs, had inherent redundancies. It could tolerate a leaner mixture under the stable conditions of high-altitude cruise, a risk the manufacturer, designing for every possible combat scenario, would never sanction. Standing by the coal stove that did little to warm the damp office, Doolittle looked at Hough and his own Chief of Staff, General Edward P. Curtis, and made a decision. "Colonel, I don't want the specifics," Doolittle said, his voice a low, serious command, "and I don't want a single piece of paper on this. If we start losing engines, it's your neck. Just get my boys over Berlin." With that verbal, undocumented order, the secret was officially sanctioned. There would be no manual update, no written directive. The technique that could determine the fate of Operation Overlord would be passed down by word of mouth, a pilot's whisper, a ghost in the machine. The dissemination began immediately, in the last days of February 1944, with the first Berlin raid just over a week away. Colonel Hough personally briefed a handful of the most trusted fighter group commanders, men like the aggressive Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group and the brilliant tactician Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th. The meetings were held in locked briefing rooms, windows blacked out, the air tense. The technique was given the bland, forgettable name, Extreme Range Cruise Control. Pilots were taught to listen for the engine to sneeze, a slight backfire, as the sign they'd pushed it too far, and then to nudge the lever forward just a fraction of an inch. It was an art, not a science, a terrifying balancing act, to be performed 5 miles above enemy soil. To translate the technique from engineering theory to combat reality, Hough needed a pilot with an innate, almost supernatural feel for the Mustang. He found him in Major George E. Preddy, Jr. of the 352nd Fighter Group, a former barnstormer who flew his P-51, Cripes A. Mighty, as if it were an extension of his own body. In a series of test flights during the last week of February 1944, Preddy perfected the settings, confirming that 400 RPM and 35 inches of manifold pressure were indeed the sweet spot. He discovered the technique was most effective above 20,000 feet, where the cold, dense air provided superior cylinder cooling. He and a few other hand-picked aces, like Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, practiced the delicate maneuver until it became muscle memory, the subtle shift in the Merlin's pitch telling them more than any gauge could. By March 1, 1944, just 5 days before the first major American bombers were scheduled to hit Berlin, the Merlin's whisper was a secret known by fewer than 50 pilots in the entire 8th Air Force. It was a classified weapon protected not by armed guards or steel vaults, but by shared risk and absolute verbal trust. Harold Haynes, the Packard engine expert, remained completely oblivious, still preaching the by-the-book gospel of the auto-lean setting, unaware that the pilots he advised were about to rewrite his engine's operational manual over the burning capital of the Third Reich. March 6, 1944, 13:10 hours, 27,000 feet over Berlin, the German pilots of Jagdgeschwader II couldn't believe their eyes. Below them, a stream of 660 B-17s lumbered toward the Erkner ball-bearing plant. But above them, glinting in the thin, cold sunlight, were the unmistakable shapes of P-51 Mustangs. Oberleutnant Otto Fonnikold, a 42 Victory ace, keyed his FUG-16ZY radio, his voice a crackle of disbelief. They were 200 miles past the Mustangs, supposed point of no return. It was impossible. It was a violation of the known laws of aerial warfare. From the ground, the confusion was just as profound. At a Freya radar station near Dubendorf, operators under the command of Hauptmann Erich Sommer tracked the hostile formations. Their reports, relayed to the Luftwaffe Fighter Control Center in Berlin, were initially dismissed. On March 4th, the first attempt on Berlin had been turned back by weather, and the escorts had turned for home exactly where predicted. But today, just 48 hours later, the radar screens showed dozens of single-engine fighter signatures mingling with the bomber plots directly over the capital. General Adolf Galland, monitoring the situation from his command post, was convinced it was an equipment malfunction, or a desperate, one-way suicide mission by a handful of glory-seeking American pilots. In the post-mission debriefing at Jagdgeschwader I's Dobritz airfield, the air was thick, with the acrid smell of cordite and the metallic tang of fear. The surviving pilots, their faces smudged with oil and exhaustion, were adamant. They hadn't just seen P-51s, they had engaged them in brutal 20-minute dogfights directly over the city. General Major Josef Schmid, the meticulous chief of staff for the Reichsverteidigung, couldn't make the numbers work. He and his intelligence officer, Major Beppo Schmid, calculated that a P-51B, with two 75-gallon drop tanks, had a maximum combat radius of 550 miles. The flight from RAF Bodny to Berlin was nearly 575 miles one way. Their official analysis, sent to Hermann Göring's office by 1800 hours that evening, concluded the Americans must be using a new, undiscovered long-range variant of the Mustang, a P-51X, or were deliberately sacrificing their pilots. The reality was far simpler and more terrifying. In the cockpit of Krieps A. Mighty, Major George E. Preddy, Jr., a former barnstormer who flew with a photograph of his sweetheart Anne, taped to his instrument panel, was performing the delicate, unwritten ritual. His hands, steady despite the bone-jarring cold, eased the mixture lever back. He was flying by feel, listening to the subtle shift in the Packard V-16507's roar. A change in vibration felt through the stick in the seat of his pants. He nudged the lever back another millimeter, finding that razor's edge between extreme fuel economy and catastrophic engine failure, a secret kept by fewer than 100 men. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, immediately began a frantic search for a hardware solution. On March 16, 1944, after a mission to Augsburg, a P-51C from the 354th Fighter Group, serial number 42103-309, was shot down relatively intact. It was transported under heavy guard to the Luftwaffe's central testing facility at Rechlin-Lars Airfield. A team of engineers led by Dr. Gunther Bock, a specialist in Allied engine technology, spent over 200 man-hours dissecting the Packard V-16507. They found nothing. No extra fuel lines, no hidden tanks, no modified carburetor jets. Their final report to General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch on April 2 was baffling. The aircraft was completely standard. The only remaining possibility, they concluded, was a new high-energy fuel, a synthetic blend with a specific gravity far lower than their own B-4 aviation fuel. The secret's greatest protection was its inherent danger and the rigorous verbal discipline imposed by commanders like Colonel Donald Blakesley. On a March 8 raid against the same Erkner plant, a replacement pilot in the 352nd Fighter Group, 2nd Lieutenant James Harrison, pushed the mixture too far back. His Merlin engine backfired twice with a sound like a shotgun blast inside a metal drum, then seized completely at 26,000 feet. Harrison bailed out and was captured. During his interrogation at Dulag Luft Oberursel by the Luftwaffe's master interrogator, Oberleutnant Hans Scharf, he couldn't reveal the secret because he didn't truly understand it. He just knew he was told to lean it out till she sneezes, and his engine had died. His testimony only reinforced the German theory of a dangerously unstable experimental fuel. This fundamental misunderstanding led to a catastrophic strategic error by the Luftwaffe High Command. Convinced the Americans were using a finite supply of a special wonder fuel, General Adolf Galland, in consultation with his top tactician Oberst Dietrich Hrubach, issued a new directive on March 20, 1944. It ordered all Jagdgeschwader to engage the American escorts as early as possible, forcing them into high-power combat to burn through their limited special fuel before they could reach Germany's heartland. This played directly into General Jimmy Doolittle's new, aggressive doctrine. Doolittle, a man who habitually chewed on unlit cigars when deep in thought, had already unleashed his fighters. The Germans were now willingly flying into the teeth of the one fight the Americans, with their newfound endurance, were desperate to have. The secret remained invisible to every form of German intelligence. Radio intercepts by the B-Dienst listening stations picked up the American pilots' chatter, but the phrases used were meaningless without context. A flight leader like Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, a tough, no-nonsense commander known for his meticulously clean flight gear, would simply say over the R-115 radio set, "Time to start milking, boys." To the German linguists and analysts listening in, it sounded like nonsensical slang. They were listening for technical chatter about fuel states or engine performance, never suspecting the war's most important secret was hidden in a phrase that sounded like a farming chore. The results were devastatingly one-sided. During Big Week in late February 1944 and the subsequent Berlin raids in March, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 fighters and, more critically, 350 veteran pilots. Men like Hauptmann Gunther Specht, the one-eyed commander of 2, JG-11, with 34 victories, and Major Rudolf Sigmund of JG-27 were killed in action. The attrition rate of experienced German Staffelkapitan was approaching 25% per month. The balance of the air war was shifting with a speed that left the German High Command reeling, and they couldn't find the reason on any blueprint or in any wrecked engine. From the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, the new reality was terrifying. Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft, the respected Commodore of JG-54, and a veteran of over 560 combat missions since the Spanish Civil War, led an attack on B-24s near Brunswick on April 8, 1944. He expected the P-51 escort to be on the verge of bingo fuel. Instead, the blue-nosed bastards of Bodny, the 352nd Fighter Group, dropped their 108-gallon tanks and engaged his formation with a ferocity and endurance he'd never witnessed. The dogfight lasted for 30 minutes, stretching 70 miles across the sky. His post-mission report to General Gulland was a cry of despair. "They are no longer tied to the bombers. They have the fuel to hunt us to our very airfields and wait for us to land. This shattered the psychological advantage the Luftwaffe had held for years. The brief, 20-minute window of unopposed attacks on the bomber streams was gone. Morale in frontline units like Jagdgeschwader 26 began to crumble. Young German pilots, some with as few as 160 total flight hours, were being sent up against American aces, like Major George Pretty Jr. and Captain Don Gentile, who had over 3,000 hours of experience and now, seemingly, unlimited fuel. The once confident hum of a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine now sounded like a funeral dirge to many of the new recruits climbing into their Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 cockpits at bases like Rhein-Hopsten. The secret security protocol was its own elegant, terrifying simplicity. It was a chain of verbal trust passed from one pilot to the next. In the pre-dawn chill of the briefing hut at RAF Leiston, a flight leader like Captain Dave Schilling of the 56th Fighter Group would take his four-man element aside. Under the dim glow of a single 40-watt bulb, smelling the damp wool of their flight jackets, he'd explain the technique. Gently, until you feel the shudder. Then a hair forward, don't chase it. It was tribal knowledge. If a pilot was shot down, there was no incriminating manual, no modified part, only the memory of a whispered instruction. Ultimately, the Germans were blinded by their own advanced engineering philosophy. Their leading engine designers, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche and Albert Friedrich of Daimler-Benz, had long since abandoned what they considered to be archaic carburetor systems in favor of sophisticated direct fuel injection. Their Junkers Jumo 213 and DB 605 engines were managed by a brilliant but rigid mechanical computer, the Kommandogerät, which automated nearly all engine functions. The concept of a pilot manually overriding and finessing a simple Bendix-Stromberg carburetor to achieve a 25% fuel saving was, to them, technically backwards and suicidally reckless. They were looking for a complex secret weapon, never imagining the answer was a pilot's intuitive analog touch. In his office at the Reich Air Ministry on April 29, 1944, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, a man who exuded a weary aristocratic confidence, stared at the red pins on his operations map. They marked confirmed P-51 sightings. The pins were everywhere, from the skies over Berlin to the runways of his own fighter bases near Hanover, where Mustangs were now strafing his pilots as they tried to land. His staff, including the usually unflappable Oberst Werner Mulders before his death, had offered no plausible explanation. The intelligence reports on captured P-51s showed nothing. The interrogations revealed nothing. They were losing the war for the sky over Germany, and the reason remained a complete, maddening, and devastating mystery. By the end of May 1944, the statistics told the story the Germans couldn't comprehend. The Luftwaffe had lost over 2 500 fighter aircraft and, more importantly, 526 irreplaceable veteran pilots since the start of the year. The average experience level of a German fighter pilot had plummeted from over 400 combat hours to just 150. The path for the D-Day invasion on June 6 was now clear of any significant aerial threat. The Merlin's whisper hadn't just gotten the bombers to Berlin. It had systematically and secretly annihilated the Luftwaffe, and its leaders went to their graves never truly understanding how. The immediate success of the Berlin raids in March 1944 fundamentally altered American strategy. General Jimmy Doolittle, a man who preferred aggressive action to defensive posturing, saw the opportunity immediately. On March 15, he issued a new directive to his fighter commanders, including the famously pugnacious Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group. The P-51s were no longer just bodyguards. After escorting the bombers to the target, they were released to hunt. Hearing the crackle of a flight leader's voice over the AN/ARC-3 radio saying, "Ramrod is complete. Go get 'em, boys," became the most exhilarating sound in the European theater, a signal that the hunters were now loose. This new doctrine forced a rapid evolution of the secret technique itself. It wasn't just about saving fuel anymore. It was about managing it as a finite, strategic weapon. Ace pilots like Major George E. Preddy Jr., a man who flew his P-51D Cripes A Mighty Third with an artist's touch, perfected a stepped cruise profile. On the April 11, 1944, mission to Oschersleben, he used the extreme lean setting for the first 90 minutes, switched to the standard auto lean for the turbulent air over the target, and then re-engaged the whisper-thin mixture for the hunt and the long journey home. This meticulous management allowed for an extra 20 minutes of high-power, fuel-guzzling combat maneuvers. All the while, Packard's Harold Haynes remained blissfully ignorant, still lecturing new pilots on the catastrophic dangers of running the V16507 engine leaner than its factory detent, unaware that his advice was being respectfully ignored 5 miles above his head. The German High Command, blinded by their own engineering dogma, continued to chase phantom technologies. General Adolf Galland, facing Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's mounting fury over the P-51's inexplicable range, became fixated on the idea of a new, high-energy fuel additive. This led to a catastrophic order on April 15, 1944, directing Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11 to engage the Mustangs far out over the North Sea, hoping to force them to burn through their special fuel reserve. The result was a turkey shoot. American pilots like Captain Don Gentile, who scored 3 kills that day, found the Germans were willingly flying into the teeth of their guns. The Luftwaffe pilots, flying superb Messerschmitt Bf 109 G-10s, equipped with powerful MW-50 methanol water injection systems, were fighting a battle of endurance they couldn't win. The Abwehr became so desperate they even began analyzing the chemical composition of captured pilots' urine, searching for biological traces of this mythical wonder fuel. The impact on the air war was immediate and statistically undeniable. By May 1, 1944, the 8th Air Force's bomber loss rate on deep penetration missions had plummeted from a horrifying 6.9% during Black Thursday in October 1943 to a sustainable 2.8%. For the men of the 100th Bomb Group at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, this wasn't just a number. It meant that on a 500-bomber raid, over 20 more B-17s and their 200 crewmen, men with names and families, were returning, the roar of their 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, a sound of survival echoing across the Suffolk countryside. As the technique's use became widespread, its security protocol became a matter of intense, unspoken discipline. The verbal-only dissemination method, insisted upon by Colonel Cass Hough, proved to be flawless. It became a rite of passage. A new replacement pilot, fresh from the States with only 250 flight hours, wouldn't be told the secret. He had to prove himself on 3 or 4 missions first. Then, a flight leader like the 56th Fighter Group's Colonel Hubert Zemke, a hard-as-nails commander who meticulously logged every detail of his missions in a small black notebook, would pull the young lieutenant aside. In the dim, smoky light of the briefing hut, he'd explain the delicate touch required, a secret that by May 1944 was shared by over 500 pilots yet never once committed to paper. The Merlin's whisper didn't just win dogfights, it unlocked entirely new strategic possibilities. The most audacious were the shuttle missions of Operation Frantic. On June 2, 1944, just days before the Normandy invasion, B-17s of the 3rd Bombardment Division, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay, flew from England, bombed railway marshalling yards in Debrecen, Hungary, and then, escorted by P-51s from the 352nd Fighter Group, flew on to land at bases in Poltava, deep inside the Soviet Union. This one, 600-mile, 8-hour odyssey, was a logistical and strategic nightmare for the Germans. Air controllers under the command of General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf could only watch in stunned silence as their radar plots showed the American formations continuing east, flying completely off their operational maps. The P-51s, using the extreme lean setting for over 5 hours, still had enough fuel for 30 minutes of combat over Soviet soil, proving that no target in the Reich was now safe. The ultimate dividend of this sustained aerial campaign was paid in full on June 6, 1944. As 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies above them were a protective umbrella of Allied air power. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory's Allied Expeditionary Air Force flew over 14,600 sorties that day. The once mighty Luftwaffe, its fighter arms shattered by months of relentless combat against long-range Mustangs, managed fewer than 200 counter-sorties, almost none of which reached the invasion fleet. The German soldiers of the 716th Infantry Division could only cower in their bunkers, listening to the incessant, unopposed drone of thousands of Allied engines, a sound of dominance made possible by a secret they would never know. By the summer of 1944, the secret had become so deeply ingrained in combat procedure that it was almost no longer a secret, but simply, quote, the way you flew the Mustang. Colonel Cass Hough, ever the meticulous engineer, continued to gather data. His analysis, presented to General Doolittle in a private briefing on July 20th, estimated that the cruise control technique had saved the 8th Air Force over 3 million gallons of 130th octane avgas between March and June alone. This was more than a logistical triumph. It represented a 15% increase in operational capacity without a single extra drop of fuel being shipped across the Atlantic, a direct blow to the effectiveness of Grand Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat Wolfpacks. Even as the war entered its final brutal phase, German intelligence was still chasing ghosts. Their revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, piloted by veterans like Oberstleutnant Heinz Bahr, was a technological marvel, possessing a 120 mph speed advantage over any P-51. But its Junkers Jumo 004B turbojets were notoriously unreliable and had a combat endurance of barely 60 minutes. The ultimate irony was that while German engineers were betting everything on a flawed technological leap, the Americans were winning with a simple, hidden technique. As late as December 1944, the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, under the grim leadership of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was still analyzing the crankcase oil from captured Merlin engines, looking for a chemical additive that simply wasn't there. The cumulative effect of this secret was the utter annihilation of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force. By the time the Wehrmacht launched its final gamble in the Ardennes in December 1944, the once proud Jagdgeschwader were a shadow of their former selves, barely able to muster 300 serviceable fighters on the entire Western Front to support the attack. The Merlin's Whisper had done more than just extend range. It had given the 8th Air Force the endurance to conduct a relentless, 9-month aerial siege that had systematically broken the back of German air power, clearing the skies for the final victory. For nearly 30 years after VE Day, the secret remained where it had always been, in the quiet, guarded memories of the pilots who lived it. The first cracks in the wall of silence appeared not in a declassified government file, but in the pages of historian Roger A. Freeman's monumental 1970 book, The Mighty Eighth. Within its 312 pages were anecdotal accounts from veterans of the 4th and 352nd Fighter Groups, men who spoke of milking the mixture and flying missions that, on paper, seemed to defy the known fuel capacity of their P-51s. The whispers grew louder at veterans' reunions over the clinking of glasses and the smell of cheap hotel coffee, but the precise, technical how remained a ghost. This created a frustrating paradox for military historians. The official Air Force histories, compiled by meticulous researchers like Dr. Alfred F. Simpson, and the technical specifications from the Packard Motor Car Company's V1650-7 engine manual were unwavering. They showed a P-51B with two 75-gallon drop tanks having a maximum combat radius of approximately 550 miles. Yet, the mission reports from the first Berlin raid on March 6, 1944, logged flight times exceeding 7 hours and 30 minutes, an impossibility according to the official fuel consumption rate of 68 gallons per hour. For decades, the numbers just didn't add up, leaving a gaping, unexplained hole in the narrative of how air superiority was won. It was a mystery that even the most respected analysts, like those at the Air University, couldn't solve with a slide rule. The dam of secrecy finally broke on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, May 11, 1982, 14:30 hours. Inside the climate-controlled archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, Colonel Cass Hough, a man of 78 years, with eyes that still held a pilot's piercing clarity, sat across from an interviewer named Dr. James C. Hasdorf. The room was silent, save for the soft whirring of a Sony TC-580 reel-to-reel tape recorder and the musty scent of aging documents. Hough, feeling the immense weight of his own mortality and the need to set the record straight for the 200 men lost on the Schweinfurt raids alone, leaned toward the microphone. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound, and decided it was finally time to confess the single most important secret of the European air war. In a calm engineer's tone, Hough laid out the forbidden recipe that had remained undocumented for 38 years. He spoke the numbers as if reciting a prayer. You set the RPM to exactly 400 and the manifold pressure to 35 inches. Then came the heresy. He described the terrifying delicate act of easing the mixture control lever back past the auto-lean detent, a move that every manual and every Packard representative like Harold Haynes swore would cause catastrophic detonation in the 27-liter V12 engine. He admitted it was a secret he and General Jimmy Doolittle had agreed to never put on paper, a verbal-only command that won the war. When Dr. Hasdorf's interview transcripts, designated AFHRAK 239.051 to 1281, were finally reviewed and cross-referenced with Hough's personal papers, it sent a shockwave through the community of World War II aviation historians. Men like Dr. Richard P. Hallion, then a curator at the National Air and Space Museum, were astonished. The answer to the P-51's phantom range wasn't a new fuel or a secret engine variant. It was a pilot's touch, a piece of dangerous, unwritten knowledge. This revelation, recorded on a simple 7-inch reel of magnetic tape, explained in an instant why the meticulous German engineers under Dr. Gunther Bach had found nothing when they dissected a captured P-51 at Rechlin in April 1944. They were looking for hardware, not a ghost in the machine. Hough's testimony on that tape reel provided the crucial human context that had been missing for 4 decades. He recounted the tense meeting in Doolittle's damp, coal-smoke-filled office at Pine Tree in February 1944, with General Edward P. Curtis standing by. He described how Doolittle, the MIT-trained engineer, didn't flinch. He instantly grasped the physics, understanding that the cold, dense air at 25,000 feet provided superior cylinder cooling, and that the Packard V16507's dual Bendix scintilla magnetos offered a redundancy that could tolerate the lean mixture. Who quoted Doolittle's exact, undocumented order, a phrase that sealed the secret's fate. Colonel, I don't want to know the specifics, and I don't want a single piece of paper on this. If we start losing engines, it's your neck. Just get my boys over Berlin. It was the ultimate calculated risk, a burden shared by only 2 men. For the surviving veterans of the 8th Air Force, the revelation, which began trickling into publications like Air Force Magazine and Warbirds International Asterisk by the mid-1980s, was a moment of profound validation. For 40 years, the men of the 352nd and 4th Fighter Groups had simply called it milking the mixture, or the Doolittle Cruise. They knew it worked, but few, if any, understood the precise engineering calculations that Colonel Cass Hough had risked his career and his life to develop. It wasn't just a cowboy trick they'd figured out on their own. It was a sanctioned, if unwritten, military secret, an engineered solution to an impossible problem. The historical narrative was officially and permanently rewritten. Textbooks and museum exhibits that had long credited the P-51's victory solely to its brilliant design by North Americans Edgar Schmude had to be updated. By 1987, the information placards accompanying the P-51 Mustang on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, were changed. The aircraft's success was now correctly attributed to a three-part formula: a superior airframe, a powerful Merlin engine, and the crucial human element of an operational technique pioneered by Colonel Hough and courageously authorized by General Doolittle. Hough's 1982 testimony also solved the enduring mystery of German intelligence's total failure to uncover the secret. Post-war analysis of interrogation records from the Luftwaffe's evaluation center at Dulag Luft Oberrüssel showed that captured American pilots, when questioned by experts like Oberleutnant Hans Scharf, couldn't explain the science. They'd just repeat their verbal instruction: lean it till she sneezes. This testimony reinforced the German theory of a faulty, experimental fuel. The Germans, under leaders like General Adolf Galland, were intellectually blinded by their own advanced engineering, looking for a complex hardware modification, never suspecting the answer was a simple, analog human touch on a machine they considered technically inferior to their own fuel-injected DB605 engines. The final, definitive piece of the puzzle was now in place. The full transcript of Cass Hough's oral history, filed away under the bland designation AFHRAK 239.051-21281, became one of the most requested documents at the Air Force Archives. The war's most decisive secret wasn't found in a dusty, declassified file marked top secret. It was a 38-year-old memory, captured on a fragile half-mil polyester magnetic tape. The Merlin's whisper was finally out, changing not just how we understood a machine, but how we understood the quiet, desperate, and undocumented genius that had truly won the war for the skies over Europe. The wake of Colonel Cass Hough's 1982 testimony was less a tidal wave and more a creeping tide, slowly but irrevocably changing the landscape of World War II history. Historians like Dr. Richard P. Hallion of the National Air and Space Museum were forced to re-examine thousands of mission reports whose flight times had never made sense. The answer wasn't in the blueprints of the Packard V16507 engine. It was locked away on a 7-inch reel of magnetic tape, file number AFHRAK 239.051-21281. Its slow whirring sound the final declassification of a 38-year-old secret. By the time General Jimmy Doolittle passed away on September 27, 1993, at the age of 96, the story of his quiet, undocumented gamble was finally becoming a cornerstone of his legend, proving that the greatest risks are sometimes taken with a nod, not a pen. The recognition that followed was academic, not ceremonial. Colonel Hough, who died in 1990, and General Doolittle were never awarded a specific medal for their secret. The victory it secured was considered its own reward. The true honor came in the rewriting of military doctrine. Today, at the U.S. Air Force Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base, the Merlin's Whisper is a classic case study in exploiting the envelope, the art of pushing a machine past its manufacturer's red lines to achieve a decisive tactical advantage. Instructors teach young pilots how Hough's understanding of the Bendix-Stromberg PD-18A1 carburetor's performance in the cold, dense air above 25,000 feet was as critical as the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing designed by Edgar Schmood. The legacy of Major George E. Preddy, Jr., killed on Christmas Day 1944, was also recontextualized. His 26.83 aerial victories weren't just a result of skill, but of an engineered endurance that allowed him to hunt when others had to flee. The sweet smell of 100-octane avgas, a constant reminder of the fine line he walked. The physical landmarks of this secret have mostly faded back into the earth. RAF Bodney in Norfolk, once home to the 352nd Fighter Group, is now quiet farmland, the roar of Merlin engines replaced by the rustle of wind through barley. Only a few crumbling sections of the 500-yard main runway and the ghostly outlines of Nissen hut foundations remain, a silent testament to the 500 ground crew who made the missions possible. The machines themselves, however, are preserved with religious reverence. Over 17 P-51 Mustangs remain airworthy today. When you stand before Cripes A Mighty preserved behind velvet ropes, you can almost feel the bone-jarring vibration and smell the hot oil and glycol, a sensory memory of a weapon that, through Hough's discovery, is estimated to have saved over 3 million gallons of fuel and the lives of at least 200 bomber crewmen in just the 4 months leading up to D-Day. Ultimately, the revelation of the Merlin's whisper permanently shifted our understanding of the Allied victory. It wasn't just a triumph of industrial might of the 8156 P-51s built by North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood and Dallas. It was a victory of human ingenuity. The names of Colonel Cass Hough and Lieutenant General James Doolittle are now forever linked to a moment of calculated, undocumented risk taken in a damp office at RAF High Wycombe on a cold February day in 1944. Their verbal pact, sealed amidst the smell of wet wool and coal smoke, proved that the most powerful weapon in an arsenal is sometimes a single, well-kept secret that allows you to break all the other rules. Today, at an air show in Oshkosh, a restored P-51D Mustang sits gleaming on the tarmac. A pilot, half a century younger than the men who first flew it into combat, climbs into the cockpit. His hand brushes against the mixture control lever, a simple red-knobbed rod with its auto-rich and auto-lean detents. For a moment, it's not just a control, it's an artifact, a key to a forgotten art. Then, with a cough of white smoke, the 27-liter Packard V16507 engine barks to life, its roar settling into that iconic, throaty hum. As the Mustang thunders down the runway and climbs into the summer sky, the glint of the sun off its polished aluminum wing isn't just a reflection. It is the last, visible echo of a whisper that crossed an ocean, broke an empire, and won a war.